The thing about Marineford was that it was already impossible before Luffy arrived. This was not a metaphor. The mathematics of the engagement: 30,000 marine soldiers, 3 admirals, a fleet of 7 warlords, the full institutional weight of the world government arranged in a killing field designed specifically to execute one man, were not mathematics that left room for interference. Sengoku had planned for everything. The base sealed with the encircling wall. The execution platform positioned for maximum visibility and minimum accessibility. The timing coordinated to the minute. The warlords deployed at the pressure points where rescue attempts would necessarily converge. He had planned for Whitebeard. He had planned for the Whitebeard pirates. He had planned for the general chaos of a conflict at this scale. He had not planned for Monkey D. Luffy. This was not entirely his fault. Planning for Monkey D. Luffy required a model of human behavior that most institutional thinking was not equipped to generate, because the foundational assumption of institutional thinking, that people in any given situation will generally do the thing that preserves their survival and advances their interests, did not apply. Luffy had arrived at Marineford via a stolen marine vessel after breaking into Impel Down, the world's most secure prison, and breaking out again with a collection of some of the most dangerous criminals alive, all because his brother was going to be executed, and that was simply not acceptable to him as an outcome. The planning failure was not Sengoku's. The planning failure was the universe's, for generating a person who operated outside the parameters of reasonable prediction. Luffy had been inside Marineford for 47 minutes when he ate the fruit. He did not know it was a devil fruit. This was important, and it was also, in retrospect, extremely typical. Luffy's relationship with information was consistent. He received it when it was directly relevant to a current physical problem and processed it with the speed and accuracy that urgency required, and he failed to receive it when it existed in the ambient background of a situation, when it was the kind of thing you notice by paying attention to context rather than by responding to immediate demands. The immediate demands of Marineford were considerable. He had taken Kizaru's laser in the chest 20 minutes ago. A beam of concentrated light energy punched through him at a velocity that by any reasonable physical assessment should have ended the engagement. It had not, because Luffy was rubber, and rubber's relationship with energy-based attacks was structural rather than dependent on toughness, and he had bounced back up with the specific resilience that made him simultaneously easy and impossible to damage. But the impact had cost him something. There was a burning in his chest that was not the wound healing but something deeper. The kind of damage that rubber could absorb but could not prevent from accumulating. He was bleeding in 3 places. His haki was depleted to a level that made Gear 2nd a serious metabolic risk. He had used Gear 3rd twice, which meant his body had spent time miniaturized and was still paying the recovery cost. He was, by the metrics of combat capacity, running well below operational. He did not think about any of this because he was Luffy and Ace was on the platform and the distance between him and Ace was the only metric that mattered. He was moving through a section of the battlefield that had become temporarily less dense. The convergence of Whitebeard's shockwave attack and a marine artillery barrage had created a brief clearing. Bodies and debris in the aftermath of massive force conspiring to produce 20 meters of relatively navigable ground. He was moving through it at speed, his sandals slapping the churned stone. His eyes fixed on the platform ahead with the absolute directional certainty of someone who had a target, and no capacity for distraction. The fruit was on the ground. It was small, smaller than most devil fruits, which tended toward the Baroque in their size and their spiral patterns and their aggressive visual announcement of their own significance. This one was the size of a large plum, deep violet shading to silver at the stem, with a pattern that was not the standard devil fruit spiral but something more complex. Concentric rings, very fine, that gave the surface the appearance of water disturbed by a stone. It sat in a small depression in the stone, surrounded by debris, apparently unnoticed by everyone in the vicinity. It had come from a marine officer who was now no longer in a position to keep it, a man named Hayashi who had served in the Marine Science Division and had been transporting the fruit for research purposes, carrying it in an inner pocket of his uniform where it had rested for 11 days while he made his way from the research facility to Marineford. He had arrived 2 days before the execution. The engagement had found him, as it found most people who were not its primary participants, in a way that did not consider his personal research objectives. The fruit had rolled from his pocket when he fell. It lay in the debris and it looked like food, and Luffy was running past it, and his body, which had been running on increasingly inadequate fuel for the past several hours, registered it the way bodies that have been running on inadequate fuel register available nutrition, immediately, completely, and with an urgency that bypassed higher processing. He grabbed it without stopping. He ate it in 2 bites, running. It tasted like, he would describe it later, on the few occasions when he was asked and actually attempted an answer, like nothing he had ever eaten before, which was notable, because he had eaten an extraordinary variety of things. It tasted like the moment before you move, like the space between intention and action, like something that had no flavor in the conventional sense but that landed in the body with the specific satisfaction of something that had found exactly where it was supposed to be. He swallowed. He kept running. For approximately 30 seconds, nothing happened. The 30 seconds were not uneventful, because nothing at Marineford was uneventful. He dodged a marine sword strike with gear second speed, took a glancing blow from a seastone-tipped spear that temporarily dimmed his haki, and vaulted over a fallen section of wall using the momentum of an explosion behind him. Standard Marineford 30 seconds. Then something changed. It was not a dramatic change, not the kind of transformation that announced itself. There was no visual effect, no surge of visible power, no moment that the combatants around him could point to and say that's when it happened. What happened was internal, structural, a rearrangement at the level of the relationship between his perception and his body that had no external signature because it didn't generate anything external. The gap closed. Every fighter, at every level of skill, operated across a gap, the gap between perceiving a threat and responding to it. The gap was tiny in skilled fighters, milliseconds, the product of training and experience, and the refinement of reflexes to their practical limit. The gap was the reason that reaction speed mattered, that reading an opponent's movements mattered, that anticipation mattered. Everything that combat training was, at its core, was an attempt to close or exploit that gap. The Ultra Fruit closed it completely. Not by making Luffy faster. His body's physical speed was unchanged. Not by improving his reaction time. Reaction time requires perception to precede response, and what happened was the elimination of that precedence. His body began moving in response to threats before his conscious mind had registered them as threats, before the signals had traveled the neural pathways from perception to processing to decision to action. The body moved first. The mind caught up. The first sign of it was a dodge. A marine sniper, stationed on the upper wall, sighting down on Luffy's trajectory, had squeezed the trigger a fraction of a second before Luffy's conscious perception registered the glint of the rifle scope in his peripheral vision. By the time the signal reached his brain, rifle, threat, incoming projectile, dodge left, his body had already moved. Not left. Right. The body had moved right, which was the correct direction, the direction that actually took him out of the bullet's path. The direction that his conscious processing had not yet arrived at because his conscious processing was still doing the initial threat identification. The bullet passed through the space where he had been. He landed in the new position and his mind caught up to his body and he thought, for a confused moment, I dodged. When did I dodge? I was going to dodge left. His body was already moving again. Another threat. 2 Marine soldiers converging from angles that his direct forward vision couldn't simultaneously cover. He felt them, somehow, not as a visual input but as a spatial fact, the way you feel the edges of a room in the dark, and his body adjusted, weight shifting, and he moved through the gap between them without contact, the 2 soldiers' swords catching nothing but air and each other, and he was past them and still running and his mind was approximately 3/4 of a second behind his body, and falling further behind with every moment. He became aware that something was different. What is he doing? Smoker said. Smoker was not given to expressing confusion. His operating model of the world was built on certainty, the certainty of law, the certainty of his own assessment, the certainty that he understood the parameters of a combat engagement, and could read it accurately. He was at Marineford in a capacity that placed him close enough to the main battlefield to see what was happening with his own eyes. And his own eyes were telling him something that his model was not processing cleanly. I don't know, Tashigi said beside him, and for once she sounded not embarrassed by the admission but genuinely uncertain in a way that transcended her usual self-assessment. Monkey D. Luffy was moving through the battlefield in a way that was not consistent with Gear Second. Gear second was visible. The steam, the pink flush of accelerated blood flow, the superhuman speed that was still, fundamentally, speed, the kind of thing you could observe and categorize. What they were watching was not that. It was movement that seemed to find the correct path through a chaotic and densely occupied space with an efficiency that could not be explained by speed alone. He was not moving faster than the threats around him. He was moving correctly, always exactly where the threats were not, always taking the line through the chaos that left him uncontacted, always occupying the space that would be empty a half-second later. It's like he knows where everyone is going to be, Tashigi said. Nobody knows that, Smoker said. I know, she said. But look at him. They looked. Luffy ran through a section that was being simultaneously worked by 3 marine units. A crossfire of orders and swords and firearms that should have been impassable for a single combatant without the kind of overwhelming force that cleared space rather than navigated it. He went through it like, Smoker searched for the comparison and found, unhappily, that the most accurate one was water, that the movement had the quality of something that found available space rather than making it, that flowed rather than pushed. He's not using gear second, Smoker said. No, he's not using hockey, not much of it. Look at his eyes, no observation hockey color change. Then what? On the battlefield, Luffy stumbled. It was a genuine stumble. His foot caught on a chunk of debris, his balance tipped, and for approximately half a second he was off balance in a way that a marine sword was already swinging to exploit, the blade coming in at the angle that the stumble created, timed perfectly. His body, without righting itself, without regaining balance in any conventional sense, bent. An angle that should not have been physically accessible to a human spine, that existed well outside the range of normal joint mobility even accounting for rubber body physics. The sword passed over a back that was no longer there, and Luffy's body unfolded from the impossible angle, and he was upright and moving again before Smoker had finished processing the sequence. Okay, Smoker said. He didn't say anything else for a while. On the command platform, Sengoku saw it. He saw it because Sengoku was the fleet admiral of the marine forces and the architect of this engagement, and he was watching the battlefield with the full attention of someone who was responsible for its outcome, tracking the significant elements, maintaining situational awareness across a conflict of a scale that required genuine strategic intelligence to manage. He saw Luffy moving through the battlefield, and he saw the nature of the movement, and he felt something that he identified, after a moment's honest internal accounting, as concern. Sengoku-san, said Garp, beside him. I see it, Sengoku said. What is he? I don't know yet. He watched for another 30 seconds. He was a man of considerable experience, had seen most things that the world produced in the category of extraordinary combat ability, had developed over a career that spanned decades a reliable taxonomy of the kinds of power that existed, and how they manifested. What he was watching did not fit the taxonomy cleanly. He ate something, he said. What? Watch his movement. It changed approximately 4 minutes ago. Before that he was using his standard techniques. After, he gestured at the battlefield. That's not gear second. That's not his hockey. Something changed. Garp was quiet beside him. His grandfather's silence, which Luffy had inherited in modified form, the particular quality of someone processing something that mattered and not speaking until the processing was complete. Devil fruit, Garp said finally. Almost certainly. We should have swept the field for. Yes, Sengoku said. We should have. He watched Luffy dodge 3 simultaneous attacks with the flowing efficiency that was becoming, in the span of 7 minutes, the new normal of his movement. What we should have done and what we now have to manage are different problems. What do we do? Sengoku looked at the battlefield. He looked at the execution platform, where Ace hung in the handcuffs, watching his brother with an expression that Sengoku could not read at this distance but could imagine, because he had a functional understanding of what the Port Gas D, Ace, and Monkey D. Luffy relationship meant to both parties, had studied it as a variable in his planning, had built the entire geometry of this execution around the certainty that if Luffy came for Ace, the emotional charge of that arrival would make Luffy irrational, exploitable, a source of chaos that could be managed. He had not planned for Luffy arriving with a power that made irrationality irrelevant. We send the Admirals, he said. Kizaru moved first, because Kizaru's power made him the fastest response to anything, and because Kizaru operated with a particular kind of casual confidence that the rest of the Admirals did not share. The confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation his power could not resolve, because his power moved at the speed of light, and everything that moved at the speed of light was, in practice, decisive. He materialized in front of Luffy from a beam of light, mid-battlefield, and threw a kick that was, by the established physical parameters of the engagement, unavoidable. Light-speed movement, no wind-up, no telegraph, no preparation that even observation haki, which Kizaru had noted Luffy was not currently running at full capacity, could read. The kick landed, or it should have landed. The geometry was correct. The speed was correct. The positioning was correct. Every component of the attack that could be evaluated as correct was correct. Luffy was not where the kick arrived. He was 12 centimeters to the left, not in a way that suggested a dodge, not in a way that had a recognizable beginning, just in a way that was the difference between contact and empty air. The same 12 centimeters might as well have been infinite, and Kizaru's foot went through the space where Luffy's head had been and found nothing. Kizaru stopped. This did not happen. He ran a rapid internal review of the sequence, and confirmed. This did not happen. His attacks landed or they were seen coming and avoided, and this attack had not been seeable, had not given any signal that could be read even by someone with advanced observation haki, and it had not landed. He looked at Luffy. Luffy looked back at him with an expression that was, honestly, more confused than any expression Kizaru had ever received from someone he'd just thrown a light-speed kick at. Not the confusion of someone who had barely survived and was processing the nearness of it. The confusion of someone who did not entirely understand what their own body had just done. Eh? Luffy said. Interesting, Kizaru said. He threw another kick. Luffy moved again. Or his body moved, the 12 centimeters again, the specific small adjustment that was exactly sufficient, no more than sufficient, nothing wasted in the movement. Clean. Efficient. Technically perfect in the way that things were perfect when they had found their optimal form. Kizaru threw a third kick, fast enough that even he was essentially testing whether speed alone could overcome whatever he was dealing with. The same result. Luffy's body found the gap. Every time. Not dramatically, not with the rubber body dramatics that usually characterized his evasive movement, not with gear seconds visible speed bursts. Just, correctly, moving correctly. Finding the exact space that was safe and occupying it with the minimal necessary movement. Borsellino, said Akiji, arriving with his characteristic unhurried quality, ice forming under his feet in the brief moment of his landing. He's not using haki to read you. No, Kizaru agreed. Then how? I don't know. Kizaru regarded this as a noteworthy admission. He did not often not know things about combat situations. He was, by experience and by the nature of his power, someone to whom most combat situations quickly became comprehensible. But I think we should not allow him to reach the platform. Akiji looked at the platform. Looked at Luffy. Ran the geometry. He's going to reach the platform, he said, with the specific flatness of someone delivering an assessment they do not enjoy delivering. Not if, Kazan. Borsellino. Akainu arrived like a geological event, the heat preceding him. The stone beneath his feet liquefying in a radius that everything alive instinctively retreated from. The magma man walking through the battle with the total assurance of something that could not be stopped by anything that was not itself catastrophic. Move aside. They moved aside. Akainu looked at Luffy. Luffy looked at Akainu. There was a moment. It was the kind of moment that Marineford had been generating since the battle began. The specific charged quality of two things that were going to collide being briefly in view of each other before they collided. The battlefield seemed to register it, the combatants in the immediate vicinity pulling back by an instinct that operated below conscious thought. The way things near a lightning strike arranged themselves differently than things far from one. Akainu raised his fist. Luffy's body, without Luffy deciding anything, dropped 2 inches and leaned 12 degrees to the right. The magma fist passed through the space where Luffy's center mass had been, and the heat of it, the tremendous, stone-melting heat, washed across the left side of his face, and Luffy felt it, felt the burn, and his body's response to that was immediate and precise. Full retreat, 10 steps back, placing him outside the magma radius, and then stillness. Akainu stared. He was not a man whose face communicated a great deal of what he was internally processing. His face communicated very little in general, a studied minimalism of expression, cultivated over decades. The face of someone who had decided that a fleet admiral did not need to reveal his assessments to his opponents. But something crossed it now, briefly, in the aftermath of the miss. It was not quite confusion. It was the beginning of the recategorization of an opponent. What? Said Akainu, and did not finish the sentence. On the platform above, Ace watched his little brother stand in front of three admirals, two of whom had already tested the thing that Luffy was apparently doing now, and neither of whom had landed a clean hit, and he felt something happening in his chest that was not the handcuffs and was not the sea stone and was not the accumulated exhaustion of imprisonment and impending death. It was something closer to the feeling he'd had when he first understood, years ago, what Luffy was. Not a rubber-bodied kid with a dream too big for his body, not the younger brother who needed to be protected and guided and worried about, but something the world didn't have a category for yet, something that the world was going to have to build a category around because it was simply going to be present until the world did. He was going to reach the platform. Ace knew it, watching him, watching the body that was moving through the battlefield with the efficiency of something that had transcended its own limits, watched his little brother's face, which was set and determined and also, genuinely and purely, confused, the confusion of someone whose body had developed an opinion and was acting on it before the mind had caught up. He was going to reach the platform. Ace felt something that he had not felt since the moment the sea stone chains went on, something that started in the chest and spread outward, that had no proper name in a language built for adequate feelings. That was approximately the intersection of relief and terror and love and the specific quality of being known, being seen, being the person that another person was crossing the impossible for. His eyes burned. He told himself it was the sea air. It wasn't the sea air. Luffy hit Akainu with a gear-second punch that he had not consciously decided to throw. His body had decided. His body had assessed the exchange of positions, three admirals, one moving to flank, the window in Akainu's guard that existed for approximately 0.3 seconds after the Magma Fist's recovery arc, and had acted on the assessment before the conscious mind arrived at the same conclusion. The punch landed on the side of Akainu's jaw with the full force of gear second, and Luffy felt the impact all the way to his shoulder, and Akainu's head moved 3 centimeters. 3 centimeters. Akainu's head moved 3 centimeters. This was, objectively, a meaningful result. Akainu's head did not typically move. It was also, objectively, not enough. 3 centimeters was not the damage that would resolve the engagement. 3 centimeters was a demonstration, of force, of the possibility of impact, of something that had not yet developed its full capacity. The admirals looked at each other. Luffy, body moving without his direction, was already running again, the platform ahead, the platform getting closer, the gap between him and Ace shrinking with every step of the stride that his body had selected as efficient, and his mind was following. He was going to reach the platform. He knew it the same way Ace knew it, looking down, not because he had calculated it, not because the math resolved that way, but because it was simply true in the way that some things were true before the evidence was complete, the way that some things were simply facts waiting for the moment to confirm them. Ace was there. He was Luffy. He was going to reach his brother. The ultra fruit hummed in his body, warm and steady and entirely new, and the world continued to receive him with a growing awareness that it was encountering something it had not previously been required to categorize. Behind him, 3 admirals looked at a retreating back. Ahead of him, the platform. On the platform, Ace. The gap was closing. The first time Luffy's body did something he actively disagreed with, he was 30 meters from the execution platform. He had been running with the specific, complete commitment that was the only mode of locomotion Luffy employed when something important was at the end of the run, and he had seen, ahead of him, a gap in the marine defensive line. A clear gap, wide enough to run through, the kind of opening that Luffy's spatial instincts, honed by years of combat, recognized immediately as an opportunity. He had aimed for the gap. He had committed to the gap. The gap was right there. His body ran left, not toward the gap. Away from it. Hard left, into a section of the defensive line that looked, to his eyes, considerably more occupied than the gap, which had looked clear and was therefore obviously the correct path, and he didn't understand why his body had gone left, and he spent approximately half a second being annoyed about it, half a second during which the gap he had identified exploded, not metaphorically. A Marine artillery shell, fired from the upper ramparts, landed in the exact center of what had appeared to be a clear corridor, and converted it into a crater 6 meters across. Luffy looked at the crater. He looked at his own feet, which had taken him left without his input. He said. A Marine sword came at him from the left, the occupied section, the section his body had apparently decided was preferable to the explosive one, and his body stepped inside it without his direction, taking him close enough to the Marine swinging it that their faces were briefly a foot apart. And Luffy looked at this Marine with the expression of someone who has temporarily misplaced confidence in their own agency, and is processing this philosophically. Sorry, Luffy said to the Marine. His body drove a knee into the Marine's midsection and continued running. I didn't decide to do that, Luffy added, to nobody in particular, because honesty was important to him even when the circumstances made honesty slightly surreal. Whitebeard was watching. He watched from the section of the battlefield that he occupied in the manner of a geographical feature, the Moby Dick's displaced position in the bay putting him at an angle that gave him a broad view of the central combat area, his own tremendous height adding to that view, his tactical intelligence operating behind his eyes with the experienced efficiency of a man who had spent his entire life understanding the mechanics of conflict. He had been watching Luffy since the arrival. He watched everyone, processed everything, maintained simultaneous awareness of a battlefield that contained more variables than any engagement he had fought in, which was a very long list. This was what made him what he was, not just the power of the Gura no Mi, not just the physical fact of him, but the mind that directed it, the strategic intelligence behind the legend. He had noticed the change in Luffy's movement approximately 40 seconds after it began. He had not immediately categorized it, because the honest accounting of what he was seeing required a moment of genuinely open assessment, which was unusual. Most things he saw on a battlefield fit into existing categories quickly. He had a very large set of categories. He had been adding to it for decades. This required a new one. Marco, he said. I see it, Oyaji. Marco was beside him, or above him, in his phoenix form, the blue flame of his regeneration flickering at the wingtips. Altitude giving him a view of the battlefield that complemented Whitebeard's ground-level perspective. He dropped lower. The movement. Tell me what you see. Marco was quiet for a moment. He had learned that Whitebeard's requests for what someone else saw were not requests for confirmation. He had already seen it, had already assessed it, had already formed a view. The request was for the additional data point of another intelligent person's independent perception. He's not thinking about it, Marco said. No. It's not observation hockey. I know what advanced hockey looks like. This isn't it. The responses are too fast for hockey to be the mechanism. Hockey still requires the perception to precede the movement, even for the best hockey users. He paused, tracking Luffy's path through a marine formation. His body is responding before the perception happens. Yes, Whitebeard said. How is that possible? Devil fruit, Whitebeard said. He ate something. On the battlefield. I saw him pick it up approximately 11 minutes ago, and I did not immediately identify the significance. A pause, which from Whitebeard communicated something, the internal acknowledgement of a thing not anticipated, the honest accounting of a gap in his preparation. I should have. What is it? I don't know the specific fruit, Whitebeard said, and the admission was clean, without defensiveness. He did not know things sometimes. And the honest acknowledgement of not knowing was part of how he knew the things he did know. But the principle, this is old. Older than devil fruits, older than hockey as it's currently understood. The martial traditions of the first peoples describe it. The body's intelligence, separated from conscious thought. The state of, what they called it in the Eastern Islands was Mushin. No mind. Marco looked down at Luffy. He looks like he has plenty of mind, he said. He looks like he's arguing with his own feet. On the battlefield, Luffy had stopped moving briefly, just a 1-second pause, which was extraordinary in context, and appeared to be looking at his own hands with the particular expression of someone having an internal disagreement with themselves about whose decision something was. Whitebeard made a sound that, from a smaller person, would have been identified as a laugh. From Whitebeard, at his scale, It registered on the nearby battlefield as a seismic event. Yes, he said. He doesn't understand it yet. The power is operating independently of his comprehension. He watched the 1-second pause end as Luffy's body resumed moving with the flowing, precise efficiency that it had been demonstrating for the past several minutes. The question is what happens when he does understand it. Is that a good question or a bad question? Marco said. It is the most important question on this battlefield, Whitebeard said, for the Marines and for us both. Luffy had arrived, in the single second of pause, at a decision. The decision was not sophisticated. Luffy's decisions rarely were, and this was not a character flaw. It was the expression of a fundamental operating principle, which was that the most important things were usually clear, and the things that looked complicated were usually just the simple things with too much noise around them. Strip the noise and the simple thing was there. The simple thing was, his body was keeping him alive and moving toward Ace, and he didn't know how it was doing that, and his options were to spend time figuring it out or to trust it and keep running. He trusted it. This was easier for Luffy than it would have been for most people, because Luffy's relationship with his own body was unusually good. Years of rubber physiology had required him to develop a trust in what his body could do that extended beyond the range of conscious prediction, had trained him to not be surprised by the things he could survive, had given him a working model of himself that included significant tolerance for I don't know exactly how that worked but it did. This was new. It was weirder than the usual things, but the principle was familiar. He trusted it and ran. And his body, the body with the ultra fruit settling into it like something finding its correct address, the body that had been reorganizing its fundamental relationship between perception and action for the past 12 minutes, responded to being trusted the way things that are good at something respond to being given space to do it. It moved. Sengoku saw the decision happen. Didn't know that's what he was seeing. But he saw the 1-second pause and he saw the resumption, and he read the resumption accurately. Whatever had been producing the anomalous movement was no longer being complicated by the user's confusion about it. The movement after the pause was cleaner, more consistent. The micro-hesitations that had been present in the first 12 minutes, the fractional interruptions where Luffy's conscious mind was trying to reassert direction and creating brief static in the system, were gone. He figured something out, Sengoku said. Garp, beside him, said nothing. He's faster now, Sengoku said. Not physically faster, the speed was the same, but the efficiency had increased in a way that produced the practical effect of speed. He was covering ground more quickly because he was wasting nothing, taking no step that wasn't the correct step, occupying no position that wasn't the correct position, the battlefield unfolding in front of him like a path that had been cleared. Garp, Sengoku said. Don't, Garp said. It was one word, delivered with the quality that Garp rarely deployed, not the boisterous, expansive energy that was his public mode, not the gruff affection that he directed at his subordinates and, occasionally, at his family, but something underneath all of that, something bedrock, the fundamental register of a man who had built his identity on the conflict between two things he loved and had managed that conflict for decades and was currently watching one of them move across an impossible battlefield with a power that nobody had predicted. Don't ask me to stop him, Garp said. Sengoku looked at the man who was arguably the most powerful Marine alive and who was currently standing on the command platform watching his grandson cross Marineford and doing nothing. I'm asking you to engage, Sengoku said. Not to stop him permanently. To slow, no. The word was stone. I've made my choice about this, Garp. I made my choice, Garp repeated. At Marineford. I chose the Marines. But I did not choose, I will not choose, he stopped. His hands at his sides closed into fists that could shatter mountains and didn't move. He's going for Ace. Let him go for Ace. And when he reaches the platform, then we have a different problem. Garp looked straight ahead. We've always had a different problem with those boys. We just didn't always know it. Sengoku looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned back to the battlefield. Signal the Admirals to converge, he said, to the aide beside him. All three. The convergence happened when Luffy was 15 meters from the platform. Kizaru from above, materializing from a beam of light that angled down from the upper atmosphere, the kick already committed before arrival. The light-speed delivery that had not landed in the first exchange and that Kizaru was now attempting with the specific adjustments his intelligence had generated from the first failure, wider arc, lower angle, aiming for where the movement would take the target rather than where the target currently was. Aokiji from the left, eyes spreading across the ground in a radius that was intended not to freeze Luffy directly but to constrain the movement space, to eliminate the availability of certain paths, to force the body's decision-making into a narrower corridor where the precision of the evasion could be overwhelmed by the reduction of options. Akainu from directly ahead, because Akainu's approach to most problems was to be between the problem and its destination, and the destination was the platform, and being between Luffy and the platform was the solution. 3 Admirals. 3 simultaneous vectors. A deliberate coordination designed to address the specific quality of the ability they were dealing with, which, Marco had been right, was not Haki, and which therefore could not be addressed by the standard counter to advanced observation Haki, which was unpredictability at a level that exceeded even Haki's predictive capacity. The 3-vector approach was not unpredictable, but it was intended to work mathematically rather than by surprise. Even a body that responded perfectly to each threat individually could not simultaneously respond to 3 threats arriving from optimal angles without taking some contact. This was correct reasoning. It was also, in practice, about to produce an educational result. Luffy's body did something that it had not done before in the engagement. It stopped, full stop, dead still, in the exact center of the 3-vector approach, with Kizaru's kick descending and Aokiji's eyes spreading and Akainu's magma fist advancing. An observer watching from outside the engagement, Sengoku, on the platform, Marco, from the air, a dozen Whitebeard pirates watching from the lines, Ace, directly above, would have described what they saw differently, each from their angle. But the common element of all descriptions, afterward, was the stillness. The complete, total, impossible stillness of a person standing in the center of something catastrophic and not moving. For 1 full second. Then Luffy's body moved in 3 directions at once. Not literally, physics did not cooperate with that. But the movement sequence was so fast, so precisely timed, utilizing the rubber body's capacity for impossible joint angles and the Ultra Fruit's perfect spatial awareness in a combination that had not been visible in the previous movement, that the result was functionally similar. He went down and through the gap between Akainu's feet as Akainu's fist passed over him, came up in the space that Aokiji's eyes had not yet reached because his body had identified the leading edge of the freeze propagation and calculated the safe zone, and the rotation of the come-up took him inside Kizaru's kick arc where the leg was at the beginning of its swing rather than the end, where the velocity was lowest and the angle was worst. All 3 attacks missed. The stillness, Marco understood, watching from above. The 1-second stop was not hesitation. It was calculation. The body, running its perfect spatial assessment, had identified that the 3-vector approach could not be resolved by movement in progress, and had stopped to solve the complete problem before initiating the solution. Stillness as a form of action. The pause that made the subsequent movement possible. He thought, this is going to be a problem for everyone. He thought, including us. He thought, good. On the platform, Ace was crying. He was not acknowledging this, was, in fact, maintaining a facial expression of fierce determination that was undermined by the wet tracks on his face, which he attributed internally to spray from the bay, which was not currently producing spray in the relevant direction. He was a pirate and a commander, and the son of the pirate king, and he was crying on the execution platform at Marineford because his little brother was doing the impossible, and the impossible had not been doing that well lately, and he was so proud. He had always been proud of Luffy. This was not a simple thing, had not been a simple thing even when Luffy was small and following him around the mountain village and getting into trouble with a consistency that bordered on supernatural. The pride had always had something complicated threaded through it, the worry, the responsibility, the specific weight of being the person that someone like Luffy looked up to, which was not a light thing to carry when you understood what it meant. But the complicated thing had not diminished the pride. Had never diminished it. It was possible to be simultaneously terrified for someone and incandescently proud of them. He had been practicing this combination for Luffy's entire life. He watched his brother stand in the gap between 3 Admiral attacks that should have been insurmountable and walk through all of them without contact, and he thought, I knew. I always knew. Knew what, exactly? That was harder to articulate. That Luffy was different. That Luffy's ceiling was somewhere nobody could see from the ground. That the grinning rubber idiot from Fusha village who had eaten a devil fruit by accident, and refused to give up on a dream that made almost no practical sense was already, in some ways that didn't depend on titles or recognition, exactly what he'd said he was going to be, or Ace said out loud. His voice came out rougher than intended. Luffy was 12 meters from the platform. Louder. Because Luffy, with all the impossible spatial awareness his body was currently demonstrating, had never been good at paying attention to things that weren't in his immediate forward focus. Luffy's head came up. Their eyes met. Ace! Luffy yelled. His voice had not changed, had never changed, was the same voice, the same pitch, the same quality of Ace that had been following him up mountains and through forests, and into every variety of trouble since Luffy was old enough to yell it. It hit Ace somewhere in the chest and lodged there. "You're late!" Ace yelled back. "I had to fight a lot of guys." Luffy yelled, still running, his body steering through the last 12 meters with the efficiency that had been its mode for the past several minutes. "Also, I ate something weird and now my body has opinions." "Your body has what?" "I'll explain later." "I'm coming, I can see that." Ace's voice cracked on the last word, which he was going to attribute to yelling over the ambient noise of a major naval battle, which was a reasonable explanation and also completely insufficient. "You idiot! You absolute!" Luffy hit the base of the execution platform. He didn't slow down. His body had identified the load-bearing structures, the grip points, the fastest path up the face of the platform in the 3 seconds before arrival, and it took him up the face of the platform like a rubber projectile that knew exactly where it was going, the ultra instinct finding the route that his conscious mind would have mapped in 10 seconds and his body mapped in a fraction of one. He came over the edge of the platform at speed and landed in a crouch and stood up and looked at Ace. Ace looked at him. 10 meters between them. The handcuffs. The sea-stone chains. The executioners, who had drawn back to the edges of the platform in the instinctive way of people who are in the vicinity of something they have assessed as significantly above their pay grade. Luffy looked at Ace. Really looked at him. The specific look that Luffy used for things that mattered, that had none of the scattered energy of his normal attention but all of his attention, all of it, focused and complete. Ace met the look. Did not look away. "Hey," Luffy said. "Hey," Ace said. His voice was steady. Mostly steady. Steady enough. "You okay?" "I've been better." "Yeah." Luffy looked at the handcuffs. "I'm getting those off. They're sea-stone. They'll suppress." "I know what sea-stone does." A pause. "My body has a plan." "Your body," Ace said slowly, "has a plan?" "Yeah. I don't know what it is yet, but it seems pretty good at this, so I'm going to let it." Ace stared at his brother. He thought about all the times over the years he had tried to understand the specific quality of Luffy's relationship with the universe, the way things bent for him, not because Luffy manipulated them, not because Luffy planned for it, but because Luffy was simply and completely what he was, and what he was seemed to create a kind of gravitational effect on events, pulling them toward the shape that Luffy's existence required. He thought, of course he ate a mysterious fruit in the middle of the worst battle in a generation, and of course it's doing something nobody can explain, and of course he's decided to just trust it. Of course. "Okay," Ace said. "Okay, do the thing. With your body. That has the plan." Luffy nodded with the absolute seriousness that he brought to things he had decided to trust. Then he looked at the handcuffs, and his body moved. The assessment happened faster than anyone on the platform could track. What Luffy's body was doing, what the Ultra Instinct was doing, in its operational mode that Luffy had not yet named and did not fully understand, was finding the exact point. Not the point to break the chain, which was sea-stone and which would resist breaking by brute force regardless of how much rubber-enhanced strength was applied. The point where the mechanism failed. The structural relationship between the cuffs lock assembly and the sea-stone material. The specific angle at which gear seconds enhanced striking force, applied with the precision of Ultra Instinct's targeting, would not break the sea-stone but would shear the mechanical lock that the sea-stone was set into. A flaw in the design. Luffy's body found it in 0.4 seconds. His fist moved in gear second, the familiar pink flush, the familiar steam, but the targeting was not his. The strike landed at an angle that he would not consciously have identified, at a force level that was exactly sufficient without excess, at a point on the lock mechanism that the designers of the handcuffs had not considered because it required knowing the exact material tolerances of both the sea stone and the metal housing and their interaction under high-velocity focused impact. The lock sheared. The handcuffs fell. Ace's wrists came free. He caught himself. His legs had been bearing reduced weight for too long, the chain's grip on his devil fruit power leaving him more depleted than he had acknowledged even to himself. And Luffy was there, immediately, his body having predicted the stumble and positioned him correctly to catch. And Ace's weight came against Luffy's shoulder, and Luffy's arm went around him and held, not the supporting grip of someone catching a falling person. The hold of someone who had crossed the battlefield to get here and had arrived and was not letting go. Ace felt his brother's arm around him and felt the solidity of it. The specific, Luffy-shaped solidity that he had known since they were children. That had been the backdrop of his understanding of what safety meant before he understood that safety was something that could be a backdrop. And he did not cry. He absolutely did not cry. The wet thing on his face was still spray from the bay. "Idiot," he said, into Luffy's shoulder. "You're okay," Luffy said. His voice had gone somewhere simpler than usual, had shed the yelling and the energy, and arrived at the specific register he used for the things that were the most true. "You're okay. I've got you. I told you not to come," Ace said. "Yeah," Luffy said. "Your letters are bad. Come on." He straightened, pulling Ace with him, and looked at the battlefield below the platform, the chaos of Marineford in its full expression, the combatants and the fallen and the fires and the marine formations, and the Whitebeard pirates pressing from the bay. He looked at all of it with the assessment of his body, which was already running its spatial calculation of the path down. "Can you move?" he asked Ace. Ace took inventory. His powers were returning, slowly, the sea stone's suppression fading now that the contact was broken, the fire building back up through his pathways with the particular feeling of something that had been held under coming back to the surface. Not full capacity. Not close to full capacity. But functional. "Enough." "Yeah," he said. "Good. Because we need to go through approximately all of those people." Ace looked at the battlefield. "Luffy," he said. "Yeah? What exactly did you eat?" "I don't know," Luffy said, with complete honesty. "But my body seems pretty happy about it." "Your body," Ace said again. "It's been good at this whole thing." He gestured, generally, at the battlefield where he had just walked through 3 Admirals and their combined efforts to stop him. "I'm going to keep trusting it." Ace looked at his brother, the brother who had crossed dimensions and oceans and the world's most defended bay for him, who had eaten a mysterious fruit and decided to trust his own body's judgment, who was standing on an execution platform at Marineford grinning with the specific grin that had not changed since he was 7 years old. "Yeah," Ace said. "Okay. Let's go." From the Moby Dick, Marco watched the execution platform. He had watched the cuffs come off. He had watched Luffy catch Ace. He had watched the two of them stand up there together, silhouetted against the Marineford sky. And he had felt something that he would not articulate directly but that the people who knew him well would have recognized from his face. He had been a pirate for a very long time. He had served Whitebeard for most of that time. He had seen things that the world's conventional moral accounting would have trouble placing, had done things in the service of the crew and the man who led it that required the specific kind of person he was, clear-eyed, capable, unbothered by the complexity of loyalty in a world where loyalty was always complicated. He watched Luffy and Ace on the platform. He thought about the road that had brought both of them here. Ace's journey from the village to the sea to the crew to the platform. Luffy's journey from the village to the sea to the impossible rescue. The specific shape of the relationship between those two journeys that had this moment as its point of convergence. He thought about Whitebeard's question, what happens when he understands it? He thought, I want to see that. He thought, I think everyone here is going to have to see that. Below him, on the battlefield, the Marines were reforming. The Admirals were regrouping. The battle was not over, was not close to over, and the platform was not the destination. The destination was the ocean, and the ocean was on the other side of everything that Marineford still had to offer. But Ace was free, and Luffy was standing next to him, and whatever the Ultra Fruit was building toward in Luffy's body, whatever understanding was coming, whatever the next stage of this was, it was coming. Marco stretched his wings and rose higher. Oyaji, he called down. I see them, Whitebeard said from below. His voice carried across the bay with the natural authority of something that did not need to try to be heard. "What do we do?" A pause. The pause of a man who had seen everything and was seeing something new and was taking the moment to see it correctly before responding to it. "We make sure they have a path," Whitebeard said. "The boy with the fruit, he will handle what he can handle. We handle what he cannot. That is what a crew does." "An ace?" "Ace," Whitebeard said, and the name in his voice had a quality that the commanders of the Whitebeard pirates recognized, the specific frequency of the old man's affection, which was large and genuine and never performed. "Ace comes home." Marco looked at the platform. He looked at the two brothers standing on it, against the Marineford sky, with the battlefield between them and the sea and Luffy's body already running its calculation of the path through. "Yeah," Marco said. "Yeah." The three admirals did not consult each other. This was not unusual. The three admirals of the marine forces did not, as a general operational principle, require consultation. Each was a complete combat unit. Each possessed of power sufficient to resolve most engagements independently, and the coordination between them when it occurred was less the product of deliberate communication than the product of three highly experienced combatants reading the same battlefield and arriving at compatible conclusions. They had worked together before. They knew each other's rhythms the way musicians know the rhythms of the people they've played beside for years, not through discussion but through accumulated shared experience, through the specific knowledge that comes from watching someone operate at the highest level of their ability repeatedly over time. What they had now was a new problem and a shared assessment of it. The shared assessment was this: the standard approach did not work. This was not a conclusion any of them had reached easily. Each had the professional's resistance to revising a model that had been reliable for a long time. Kizaru's light-speed attacks were the fastest delivery system for force that the marine arsenal possessed. Akiji's ice could constrain and immobilize almost any opponent regardless of their speed or power. Akainu's magma was the most destructive offensive capability in the field. The combination of these three things, applied to a single target, had not previously failed to resolve an engagement. It had failed to resolve this one. The failure was not a mystery, exactly. They had each, independently, identified the mechanism. The target's body was responding to their attacks before the attacks were telegraphed. Not predictive in the hockey sense, not reading their intentions through spiritual awareness, but responding to the physical reality of the attack, the air pressure change, the heat signature, the acoustic signature of movement, at a processing speed that was below the threshold of conscious thought. You could not deceive it. You could not misdirect it. You could not overwhelm it with speed because it was not processing speed, it was processing correctness. The question was whether correctness had limits. Kizaru believed it did. Everything had limits. The fruit was new, Luffy had eaten it within the past hour, the body was still integrating it, the ability was still finding its parameters. New abilities had gaps. New abilities had edges that the user hadn't found yet. The attack that would fall through one of those gaps was the attack worth finding. Akiji believed the limits were environmental. The ability found safe spaces and moved into them. Eliminate safe spaces and the ability had nowhere to move. The ice was not about freezing Luffy directly. It never had been. It was about constraining the geometry of his options until the options ran out. Akainu believed the problem was force threshold. Ultra Instinct, in its current form, was moving Luffy away from danger, but there was a level of force that outpaced movement as a solution, a force so large that the safe space outside its radius was further than the body could move in the available time. Akainu's magma, scaled to its full output, might simply be too large to dodge entirely. Three different analytical approaches to the same problem. Not discussed. Arrived at independently and expressed through action simultaneously. They moved. The ice came first. Akiji, Kuzan, moved with the specific unhurried quality that his power allowed him, ice spreading from his feet in a propagating wave that covered the ground between the platform and the bay in a growing radius. He was not running. He did not need to run. The ice ran for him, covering ground at a rate that exceeded most movement speeds, and the effect was environmental rather than targeted. He was not trying to freeze Luffy, was not chasing Luffy with the ice, was converting the terrain itself into a surface that changed the physics of movement. Ice was not frictionless in the way that fiction often portrayed it. Ice, specifically the kind of dense structural ice that Akiji generated, was a surface with specific properties: high reflectivity, reduced grip, a tendency to shatter under concentrated point force loads in ways that redistributed the energy of movement unpredictably. What it did to the battlefield was eliminate certainty. The ground that had been stone, with all the reliable properties of stone, the known friction coefficient, the known structural response to force, the predictable give and take of a surface that fighters trained on and knew, was now something different. Something that changed the inputs to any movement calculation. The Ultra Instinct was a biological system operating on biological inputs. Change the inputs enough and even a perfect system needed a moment to recalibrate. That was the theory. Luffy's feet hit the ice. His body did not slip. His weight distribution shifted, not a conscious adjustment, not a deliberate compensation, but the automatic postural response of a system that had already sampled the new surface's properties in the first contact, and updated its model before the second contact arrived. His stride pattern changed, the spacing and timing adjusting to the ice's actual properties rather than the expected stone properties, the change happening in the span of 2 steps, invisible to anyone watching who wasn't looking specifically for it. The ice had not worked the way Akiji intended, but Akiji had not expected it to work immediately. The ice was not the attack. The ice was the setup. Kizaru materialized from 3 directions at once. Not literally, the laws of physics remained operative, but the light speed travel between materialization points was fast enough that the 3-point entry sequence happened in a window that the human nervous system perceived as simultaneous. 3 flashes. 3 positions. 3 kicks committed before the light had fully resolved into Kizaru's form at each location. The targeting was different from his previous attempts. Not at where Luffy was. Not at where Luffy's observed movement pattern would take him. At the intersections, the points where any movement away from any one of the 3 kicks would bring Luffy into the path of one of the other 2. He had mapped, from his observation of Luffy's evasion patterns over the past 7 minutes, the spatial logic of the Ultra Instinct's movement, and moved to the minimum safe space, the exact distance necessary to avoid contact, no further. It was efficient. It was optimally efficient. Optimal efficiency had a geometric vulnerability. If you covered enough of the available geometry, optimal efficiency ran out of geometry to be efficient within 3 kicks. 3 angles. The coverage calculation had been running since the last exchange. He had done this math at light speed, which was the only speed he operated at when he was being serious, and the math said the coverage was sufficient. The math was almost right. Almost. Luffy's body did the thing it had done on the platform. The full stop, the 1-second stillness, the complete pause that was not hesitation but computation. It stopped in the center of the 3-vector approach and ran the geometry and found a gap. Not the gap Kizaru had planned for. Not the gap between any 2 of the 3 kicks. A gap that existed in the brief window between the first kick's commitment and the second kick's arrival. A window of approximately 0.15 seconds in which the geometry of the 3-point approach had a specific blind spot, created by the angle of Kizaru's second materialization relative to his first, that he had not accounted for because it was small enough that no movement system that required conscious processing could exploit it. The Ultra Instinct did not require conscious processing. Luffy's body moved through the 0.15 second window. The 3 kicks arrived in the space he had just left, and found each other. Kizaru's own kicks collided, not catastrophically, not with the kind of impact that would damage him, because light speed recovery from a miskicked position was within his capacity, but with the specific undignified quality of an attack that has hit nothing but the air where its target used to be. He resolved the collision and reoriented and looked at Luffy. Luffy's body was already looking back at him. Not Luffy, Luffy's body. The distinction was becoming visible to trained observers. Luffy's face had an expression on it that was not quite his standard combat expression, not the fierce and grinning look that was his usual mode, but something more neutral, the face of someone who was present in their body but not entirely in command of it, a passenger in a vehicle that was being driven very well. Interesting, Kizaru said for the second time. He said it with less certainty than the first time. Akainu did not find the exchange interesting. Akainu found the exchange clarifying. The gap in Kizaru's 3-point approach had been small. He had seen it from his position, had processed it, had already updated his own approach to exclude similar vulnerabilities. The problem with Kizaru's method was that it was geometrically sophisticated but individually delivered. The attacks came from one source in rapid sequence, which meant there was always a temporal gap between them, however small, and temporal gaps were what the Ultra Instinct exploited. The solution was not temporal. The solution was spatial. Magma did not arrive in sequence. Magma, at sufficient scale, arrived as an environment. He raised both arms. What followed was not a targeted attack in the conventional sense. It was a terrain modification, a transformation of the area between the platform and the bay into a kill zone, magma erupting from the ice-covered ground in multiple points simultaneously, the heat converting Aokiji's ice to steam in a radius that expanded rapidly, the magma itself spreading in the pattern of a contained flood, not a projectile but a tide. Unavoidable not because it was fast but because it was everywhere. The safe spaces that the Ultra Instinct required simply ceased to exist within the affected radius. The radius was large. Luffy's body stopped. Not the computational stop, a different stop, the stop of a system that has run its assessment, and found the assessment returning an unfamiliar result. There was no safe space in the radius. The body had looked for the gap that was always there, had found every gap closing simultaneously, had arrived at a calculation that the previous 12 minutes had not required it to make. There was no path through. There was a path over. Luffy went up. Not Gear 3. Gear 3 was a different calculation, a size modification that the Ultra Instinct had not used and did not reach for now. The body found the vertical axis, which the magma flood was not covering because Akainu's spatial transformation was horizontal, and Luffy went straight up, rubber legs functioning as springs, the launch converting horizontal threat avoidance into vertical displacement, taking him above the magma radius to a point where the immediate threat geometry simplified. And then, from above, looking down at the three Admirals arranged in the magma-modified terrain, Luffy's body did something that none of the previous exchanges had included. It attacked. Not defensively. Not incidentally, not as a byproduct of moving through a gap in their positions. Deliberately, purposefully, with the same precision that the Ultra Instinct had been applying to evasion now directed at offense. Luffy's arm stretched, rubber arm, full extension, the arc curving down from the height of the jump, and the hand at the end of it moved not to where Kizaru was standing but to where Kizaru's weight distribution, in the process of reorienting from the mid-kick, was committed. The point of minimum stability, the point where the body was between positions, where the mass was not over the base, where the normal defensive response to incoming force was unavailable. The punch landed on Kizaru's shoulder. It was not a finishing blow. It was not intended to be. The force and the angle and the targeting were calibrated, by whatever the Ultra Instinct was calibrating by, to the exact level that would be effective, and no further. It landed and it moved Kizaru, actually moved him, displaced him laterally, the light body staggering one step in a way that Kizaru had not staggered in recent memory, and it did so with an efficiency that wasted nothing. Kizaru looked at his own shoulder. The stagger had been one step. He had recovered. He was, in the accounting of the engagement, uninjured. But the step had happened, and they all knew what it meant. The Ultra Instinct had found his gap, had targeted it precisely, had demonstrated that its offensive application was not the blunt force of Gear 3, or the speed-enhanced impact of Gear 2, but something more specific. It found the weakness. Whatever the weakness was, structural, positional, momentary. It found it, and it hit it. It's learning, Aokiji said, not to Akainu or Kizaru specifically. To the battlefield, to the situation, the observation delivered as assessment rather than conversation. All abilities learn in their first hour, Akainu said. That is why we end this now. Ace had been watching. He had been watching since the moment his wrists came free, cataloging what he was seeing with the tactical intelligence that Whitebeard's commanders developed out of professional necessity, reading a battlefield, assessing the variables, identifying the critical points and the developing threats and the shape of the engagement as it was unfolding. What he was seeing was his little brother in the middle of the most dangerous three-person combat situation that Marineford had produced so far, and his little brother's body was doing very well, actually, was doing extraordinarily well, but was currently pinned above a magma field on a vertical axis while three Admirals reconfigured their approach based on what they'd just observed. He was also watching the reconfiguration. Akainu was the threat. Akainu was always the threat. His power had the property that made it distinct from the other two, which was that it could not be entirely avoided by movement, only by sufficient distance, and sufficient distance was not currently available. The magma field was expanding. The next attack was going to be larger. Ace looked at his hands. The fire was back, not full capacity, not the overwhelming power that the sea stone had been suppressing for however many days he had been on that platform, but enough. Enough for this. Enough for what the situation required, which was not a finishing blow but a specific intervention, not stopping Akainu, not defeating Akainu, but creating the moment that Luffy needed. He thought about Luffy's body and its opinions. He thought, if the body is looking for gaps, I can make a gap. He jumped. It was, from a tactical standpoint, an objectively bad decision. Ace had been free for approximately 4 minutes. His power was at partial capacity. His legs were unsteady from the chains. He was jumping from an elevated platform into the center of a combat engagement that he had just been rescued from, moving toward the most dangerous individual on the battlefield. It was also completely correct, and Luffy knew it the moment it happened, because the Ultra Instinct was a biological system and biological systems responded to what the body knew, and what Luffy's body knew, what his body had known since they were children. What was encoded somewhere below the level of conscious memory in the way that things learned early and deeply are encoded, was Ace, the specific spatial signature of Ace in motion. The Ryatsu, if Luffy had had that word for it then, or the intent, or simply the fact of his brother moving in a particular direction with a particular purpose. His body responded to it the way it responded to everything that was correctly understood. It integrated the new input, updated the spatial model, and found the new geometry. Ace landed beside him, flame already building, and looked up at him with the expression, not the older brother managing expression, not the worried expression, not the expression of someone who had been thinking about self-sacrifice for the past 5 minutes, of someone who was completely present in the moment, and completely clear about what it required. You go forward, Ace said. I'll make the opening. Luffy looked at him. Don't do the thing, Luffy said. What thing? The self-sacrifice thing. I came here so you wouldn't. You're not doing that thing. Ace stared at him. I'm not doing a self-sacrifice thing, you idiot. I'm doing a covering fire thing. Those are completely okay, Luffy said. But if it turns into the other thing, it's not going to turn into the other thing. I'll be really mad. I know, Luffy. Like actually mad. Not yelling mad. Quiet mad. I know what quiet mad is. We grew up together. Ace grabbed his brother's shoulder with a grip that was warm literally and figuratively, the fire running through his skin at the temperature he had always been, the temperature that had been a fact of Luffy's childhood alongside the trees and the mountain and the smell of the village. I'm covering your path to the bay. You go. Your body knows the way. Luffy looked at him for one more second. The Ultra Instinct was running its spatial assessment. The path to the bay was there, not clear, not unoccupied, but there, the geometry of it available, the gaps and the timings and the sequence of movements that would carry him through if he moved correctly. His body was ready. He looked at his brother. Don't take the magma hit, he said. Please. Ace's expression did something complicated. I won't, he said. Luffy nodded. He ran. What followed was, for those who witnessed it and survived to describe it, the most technically extraordinary 4 minutes of the Marineford engagement. Luffy ran through the battlefield with Ace providing covering fire, not the massive, area effect releases that represented Ace's power at its most visually impressive, but targeted, precise interventions, fire that landed not on the Marines and Admirals themselves but on the specific positions they were moving toward, that created the heat barriers and the forced repositioning that opened the paths Luffy's body was calculating. Ace was reading the same geometry, working from the same spatial logic, creating the gaps that the Ultra Instinct identified and moved through. They had not coordinated this. They had not discussed it. It was the product of years of knowing each other's movement patterns, of the specific compatibility of people who had trained and fought and gotten into trouble together from childhood, expressed through the medium of a combat engagement that required it. The Admirals encountered it, and found it significantly harder to address than Luffy alone. Kizaru's light-speed approaches kept finding Ace's fire barriers at the angles that cut off repositioning. Aokiji's eyes found the specific radii that Ace's heat was maintaining, the contested temperature boundary creating terrain that neither element fully controlled. Akainu drove forward with the force that had always resolved engagements before, magma expanding, and found that Luffy had already moved, guided by a body that had found the gap in the timing, and that the magma was landing on the contested terrain and the stone of the battlefield rather than its intended target. 3 minutes. 3 minutes of this. Luffy moving, Ace covering, the gap between them and the bay shrinking, and then Akainu made the decision that the situation required from his perspective, which was the decision to stop addressing the engagement tactically and address it with finality. He stopped moving. He pulled the magma into himself, not depleting it, not dismissing the attack, but consolidating it, drawing it back from the terrain modification expression into a concentrated form. The power gathered in a way that the Marineford combatants who had seen him operate at full capacity before recognized as the precursor to his most devastating technique. He was going to end it. Not Luffy. Not Ace. The area. The 40-meter radius between the platform and the bay that was currently the operational theater of the escape attempt. He was going to convert it. Sengoku saw it from the command platform. He made a decision. Stop him, he said. Garp looked at him. Not the boys, Sengoku said. Akainu. If he does a full release in that radius. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The Marines in the affected area, the Whitebeard pirates in the affected area, the bystanders and the wounded and the people who were in that 40-meter circle for any of the dozens of reasons that people were places during a major engagement. They were not the target. They would not be distinguished from the target by what Akainu was building. Garp moved. Whitebeard also moved. He moved because he had been watching the consolidation happen and his assessment of it matched Sengoku's. The full release would not distinguish between combatants. And among the combatants in the radius were his sons, were the people he had brought to this battlefield to save the one person who stood on that platform. Were Ace, who was free now and fighting and whose freedom had been the only objective that had ever mattered. The Gurugura no Mi's shockwave hit Akainu from the left at the same moment Garp's fist hit him from the right. The collision of those three forces, Akainu's consolidated magma meeting the simultaneous impact of the two most powerful figures in the engagement on opposite sides, produced something that the battlefield registered as a seismic event. The ground cracked in a radius. The stone heaved. The magma that Akainu had been consolidating released in an uncontrolled burst rather than the directed technique it would have been, spraying upward and outward in a pattern that was devastating to the immediate terrain and to the structural integrity of the platform's base. But that sent its energy into the sky rather than the horizontal space where the combatants were. The sky took it. The sky could take it. In the aftermath of the collision, Akainu, who was damaged, who had taken simultaneous hits from the two people on the battlefield with the power to damage him, who had the specific quality of a geological formation that had been struck by something larger than expected and was processing the impact, stood in the crater his own release power had created and looked at the battlefield. Garp stood across the crater from him. Whitebeard stood at the edge of it. And Luffy and Ace, in the 4 seconds that the collision had created, had crossed the remaining distance to the bay. Luffy hit the water at the bay's edge and immediately began drowning, because he ate a devil fruit and devil fruit users and ocean water had an established relationship that did not improve for the purposes of escape, and his body, which had been extraordinarily competent about most things for the past 20 minutes, apparently did not have an opinion about swimming that it was able to act on. Ace pulled him out. You can't swim, Ace said, holding his brother above the water line with one hand while treading water with the other, both of them in the bay, the battle still audible behind them, the Moby Dick visible ahead. I know I can't swim, Luffy said, from the undignified position of someone being held above water by the person they just rescued. You jumped into the bay. My body did. Your body jumped into the bay. I think it was the fastest path to the ship. The fastest path to the ship, Ace said slowly, went through the water that you cannot. I think it accounted for the part where you'd get me out. Ace stared at him. He thought about the Ultra Instinct. He thought about a biological system that processed spatial information at speeds below conscious thought. He thought about what it meant that the system had apparently included Ace will pull me out as a reliable input in its path calculation. That's, he started. Yeah, Luffy agreed. That's actually, I know. Ace looked at his brother, held above the water of Marineford Bay, grinning with the specific grin that had not changed since he was small. The grin that had followed Ace up every mountain and through every forest, and into every variety of trouble since before either of them understood what trouble was. He started laughing. Not the polite kind. The real kind, the kind that came from somewhere genuine and couldn't be stopped once it started. The kind that was the body's only available response to something that was simultaneously absurd and true, and overwhelming in a way that laughter was the only language for. Luffy grinned wider. Come on, he said. The ship. Yeah, Ace said, still laughing. The ship. They moved through the water toward the Moby Dick, Ace pulling them both because Luffy was categorically useless in water and had apparently made peace with this. And behind them Marineford continued its accounting of what had just happened, and 3 admirals stood in various states of having been significantly inconvenienced by a rubber boy and his brother, and the world, in the slow, institutional way that worlds process things that didn't fit existing categories, began the work of understanding what it had seen. On the command platform, Sengoku stood very still. He was a man of long experience and genuine strategic intelligence, and he was doing, with that intelligence, what it was built for, assessing the current state of the engagement, and the engagement's likely trajectory. Ace was free. Luffy had a fruit that nobody had anticipated and that had performed, in its first hour of integration, in ways that exceeded the parameters of any pre-battle assessment. The engagement had not resolved the way it was supposed to resolve. He thought about what it meant. He thought about the Yonko and the power balance, and the administrative history of the next decade, the political consequences of what had happened today, the questions that would be asked in the chambers that actually governed the world. He thought about Luffy's grin. He thought about what Garp had said. We've always had a different problem with those boys. Yes, Sengoku said to no one. We have.